For those of you who struggle to decipher the vague contents of books, who can't remember names, and who just can't be bothered to track down all the hidden bits of history tucked away in artifact sets and weapons, but still want to learn about the lore of a region, this is the video for you. Welcome to a beginner's guide to Genshin Lore Inazuma Edition, a contextual summation of all the historical events of Inazuma and Enkanomiya from the beginning of Teyvat's recorded history all the way up to the moment when the traveler arrives. Again, this video is a summary to be used for context and learning purposes, and it is not meant to be comprehensive, so it's not going to contain everything. This video will also contain no theories, but may contain a few assumptions or speculations about timeline placement whenever the timeline is particularly unclear, but such assumptions and speculations will be clearly marked. Citations and sources can be found in the description box, while updates and corrections will be available in a pinned comment below. So with all of that out of the way, my name is Ashikai, and this is a beginner's guide to Inazuma. Our story begins over 6,000 years ago, a time when Teyvat was ruled not by people or archons, but by dragons, also known as bishops. Then the Primordial One appeared, a supreme and powerful entity that would come to rule over Teyvat. It created 4 shades of itself and conquered the world, forcing the surviving bishops into hiding deep underground or under the ocean. Then the Primordial One separated the earth from the sky, created the sun, the 3 moons, and presumably night and day, and then proceeded to create laws such as gravity. With the help of one of its shades, it also created flora, fauna, and eventually, humans. Humans then entered a covenant with the Primordial One, and they lived in a sort of blessed utopia, also known as the Unified Civilization. That is, until the Second Throne of Heavens came. With their arrival came a war just like the one between the Primordial One and the bishops. This war caused parts of the earth to collapse and fall beneath the surface. Enkanomiya was one of these areas. Having fallen beneath the waves and all routes to the surface blocked off, the people of Enkanomiya had to adapt to living in the darkness. They lived in fear of the bishops that hunted them in the dark for many years until a good chunk of their number had never even seen the original sun. It was then that a sage by the name of Abrax allegedly had a vision in a dream gifted to him by one of the Primordial One's shades, known by the name of Ishtaroth, also known as the Thousand Winds of Time, or Kairos. From that vision, he was able to design and construct the monument known as the Dainichi Mikoshi, also known as the Helios. The light of the Helios repelled the bishops, and the people of Enkanomiya began to rebuild their civilization from scratch. But with safety comes greed, and sure enough, a group of nobles soon rose to power in this new civilization and convinced the people to worship the Helios as a god, and then installed a child ruler known as the Sun Child to act as its avatar. Abrax and others like him objected to this new order, but the Sun Children and their puppeteer nobles imprisoned him until he died. So that didn't go anywhere. The Sun Children themselves were just puppet rulers, and their reign was full of corruption on behalf of the nobles that controlled them. In order to keep the puppet rulers easy to manipulate, the nobles would sacrifice them to the Helios once they reached a certain age, probably before they hit their teens. Now around or just before this time on the surface, the Archon War was still in full swing. The snake god Orobashi had been defeated multiple times in combat and decided to retreat beneath the ocean instead. A young Enkanomiyan child found him in the serpent's bowels and asked him to become their god. Orobashi agreed and helped to overthrow the rule of the Sun Children, therefore becoming the supreme ruler of Enkanomiya in its stead. Meanwhile, back on the surface, Surumi Island was another civilization that was in a bit of trouble. The people of Surumi lived unaware of the world outside of their island that was shrouded in fog, and no one who left their island ever returned, and they never had any visiting travelers either. They worshipped the Thunderbird, known by the name as Kapatsir, as their protector, and they offered her blood sacrifices in exchange for her blessing. Kapatsir kinda just ignored them until she met a young boy named Ru, who sang to her. She became quite fond of him and promised to meet him again. However, Ru was slated as the next blood sacrifice to Kapatsir, so when she returned and found him dead, she was furious. She ravaged the island with her lightning and killed everyone in the process. Then she left Surumi in favor of Khaenriah Island. Then, around 2,000 years ago, the twin gods Baal and Beelzebul emerged as the winners of the Archon War in the region now known as Inazuma. Beelzebul, also known as A, thought her sister Baal, also known as Makoto, to be better suited to being the Archon and then sacrificed herself so that Makoto could ascend to the throne of Celestia. As Archon, Makoto allegedly reforged A's body and recovered her divine will, allowing her sister to become her Kagemusha, or shadow double. The people of Inazuma were not aware that their Archon had a twin. Meanwhile, back underground, Orobashi stumbled upon the book called Before Sun and Moon, and through an unknown series of events, was sentenced to death by Celestia for reading it. He was somehow able to negotiate an extension on his execution date, and slowly began the process of migrating the people of Enkanomiya back to the surface. He created the island of Watatsumi from the blood coral branches of his body and taught the people of Enkanomiya the language and culture of the people of Inazuma. He and the Electro Archon may have established some kind of truce, as this time period was described as rather peaceful. He also began an investigation into the evolution of the Bishops, leading to research into methods of grafting his blood coral branches onto their body as a way for his people to access his power even after death. At some point during this transition, delegates from Khaenriah arrived in Enkanomiya searching for the same book that sealed Orobashi's fate, the Before Sun and Moon book. They did not successfully retrieve it and left soon after, although the Abyss Order would attempt to find it again a few thousand years later. Now, Watatsumi and Inazuma coexisted for a considerable period of time until it became clear that the soil of Watatsumi was unable to support its people. Famine and disease became commonplace, so the people begged Orobashi to solve this problem for them, since he was their god. This issue, coupled with the threat of his inevitable execution by Heaven's will, forced Orobashi to sacrifice himself. To do this, he staged a coup. He invaded Inazuma from the west, clashing with Raiden A in combat, each god with their own armies in tow. The Watatsumi Shrine Maiden Moon died in combat against A's Tengu general and dear friend Sasayuri, who later fell in combat against Moon's apprentice Akuo. A then managed to corner Orobashi on Yashiori Island and cleaved him in two with her Muso no Hitotachi, creating the Musojin Gorge and putting a definite end to the war. With the death of their god, Watatsumi officially became a part of Inazuma, but the lingering power and resentment of Orobashi manifested itself as the phenomenon known as the Tatarigami. Several wards were erected to contain this power, and the Jakotsu mine was built to harvest the crystal marrow that grew from Orobashi's bones. It would later be used in the creation of jade steel, one of the primary specialty materials used to craft Inazuma weaponry. This event likely marks the very beginning of the Raiden Gokuden, although this is speculation. The Raiden Gokuden was a collective of 5 different branches of swordsmithing schools, which would play an important role in Inazuma's more recent history, so more on that later. Now, around this time, Kapatsir, the Thunderbird from Surumi Island, had been deemed too dangerous to leave roaming around unchecked. More specifically, it's thought that Kapatsir was a threat to the citizens of Khaenriah Island, so A struck her down. Seals were set up around the island, specifically at the Asase Shrine, to keep its lingering resentment at bay, a similar treatment to Orobashi. Not long after this, Kitsune Saigyu was thought to have taken up residence at Narukami Shrine and began to care for the sacred Sakura. Then, roughly 400 to 500 years ago, Yae Miko was born in the Hakushin lands. She moved to Narukami Shrine while she was still a child in order to be near Kitsune Saigyu, who she very much admired. Kitsune Saigyu was greatly revered by not just Yae Miko, but also the people of Inazuma. She was often worshipped as a goddess, even though she wasn't technically one. She even had a special bodyguard, the Yogo Tengu, known as Reizenbo, who was quite obviously famous for her strength. The famed strength of the Tengu led Takamine the Mist Splitter to challenge Reizenbo to a duel for the Thundering Pulse Bow, which was in her possession, and this duel ended in a tie. Without a clear winner, Takamine decided he would become Reizenbo's servant for a few years at Narukami Shrine with the promise that he would receive the Thundering Pulse at the end of his service. During this time, he trained extensively with the Tengu, and later he taught all that he learned to the woman he loved, Asase Hibiki, the Shrine Maiden of Khaenriah Island. She, along with Kamuna Harunosuke and Mikoshi Nagamasa, also trained with the Yogo Tengu and became known as the Yogo Three. As a rather important aside, around this time, a man named Hiragi Hiroshi also founded the city of Rito on a previously deserted island, and with that city built, Inazuma became the nation we now recognize today. And then came the cataclysm. As the cataclysm of Khaenriah reached Inazuma from across the sea, Takamine the Mist Splitter and Mikoshi Chiyo joined A on the front lines to defend their home from the hordes of dark beasts. Takamine is supposedly the first to fall, going missing for a time. He was eventually found horribly corrupted by the abyss in the forest on Narukami Island. Asase was forced to kill him with the thundering pulse bow he gave her. Chiyo, on the other hand, continued to fight until she was swallowed whole by a monster with a tiger's body and a serpent's tail, most likely a type of Nue. She tore through its stomach and freed herself, earning her the name of Tora Chiyo, but she was stained by the abyssal corruption in the process. Eventually, she turned her blade against A, who retaliated, cutting off Chiyo's sword arm and horn in the process. Chiyo vanished while her fate was still left unknown. Drawing her blade against the Archon's Kagemusha was the same as drawing the blade against the Archon herself, and was seen as an act of betrayal that her children, Doki and Nagamasa, would have to bear. Doki would go into seclusion while Nagamasa would join the shogunate. Kitsune Saigyu was not on the front lines at first. She tried to protect her friends in her own way instead. In one notable instance, she tricked the Tanuki Ioroi into playing a game of hide-and-seek in the forest, convincing him that all of the bad things he saw were only her illusions. She thought this would prevent him from leaving the forest and getting involved in the battle with the dark beasts. It worked, albeit a little too well, but we'll come back to this in a bit. Raiden Makoto wasn't powerful enough to fight on the battlefield like her sister, so she decided to travel to Khaenriah instead to try to resolve the source of the calamity as the Electro Archon, without telling Raiden A. When A learned of her sister's movements, she asked Saigyu and her protector, the Yogo Tengu Reizenbo, to protect Inazuma in her stead while she was gone, while she went to retrieve Makoto. Kitsune Saigyu did her best but was ultimately consumed by the corruption and dissolved into filth that would later accrue in the roots of the sacred Sakura. Her memory within the ley lines would return periodically as the ghost of a masked shrine maiden. A eventually made it to Khaenriah just in time to listen to her sister's last words. Devastated, she took the electro-gnosis and what was left of Makoto's consciousness and placed it in her sword before returning to Inazuma. In returning to Inazuma, she discovered that the new Irminsul, the sacred Sakura, had appeared at Narukami Shrine, and that she was the only one who seemed to not recognize it. Like it had always been there, but she'd just never noticed it before. But by using the power of this tree, she was able to successfully purge the monsters from Inazuma, and the cataclysm, in Inazuma at least, came to an end. Unable to confirm Saigu's death and believing her to still be alive and trapping him in a series of illusions, Ioroi threw a bit of a nasty tantrum in the forest and was turned to stone by Harunosuke, one of the Yogo Three, as punishment. Having failed to protect Saigyu, the Yogo Tengu Reizenbo went into self-exile, leaving behind her daughter Teruyo. Grieving over the loss of her dearest friends, Chiyo, Saigyu, and her sister Makoto, A began the construction of a special doll that would be indistinguishable from other life forms. Initially, she planned to place her sister's gnosis inside this doll as a kind of power source, but when she did so, the doll cried. She deemed the doll too fragile and her design too flawed and left it to sleep forever, either in the Shake Pavilion or the slumbering court. She thought this to be an act of mercy since she couldn't bring herself to destroy it. But this doll would not see things the same way she did, and would eventually become known as Scaramouche, the Fatui Harbinger. After her first failure, A changed her plan and built herself a brand new doll that lacked any emotions at all. Then she sent the Gnosis to Yaemiko at Narukami Shrine for safekeeping, and destroyed her mortal form and sealed her own consciousness into her sister's sword, which she then placed inside the emotionless doll. Within the sword, within the doll, she would meditate eternally to stave off the effects of erosion. Over the next 50 or so years, there were several events that happened concurrently. First, Doki, one of Chiyo's children, went into a kind of exile for a while, during which time he challenged the Tengu Teruyo to many duels over the course of 13 years. Towards the end of this time, he had managed to invent an entirely new style of swordsmanship, and Teruyo granted him a brand new last name, Iwakura. Iwakura Doki established the Iwakura clan, which became known for its incredibly unique swordsmanship. He also became the swordsmanship instructor for the Kujo clan. His swordsmanship was also adopted by the Nobushi and the Kiragi and was later used as the basis for the infamous combat puppets known as the Magu Kenki. 2 Magu Kenki puppets were known to be constructed based on the Iwakura art of swordsmanship. Now, in theory, their Oni masks were either based on Doki or his mother Chiyo, as they both were Onis or at least had Oni blood. Now, around this same time, a pirate from Seirai Island by the name of Akodomeki was gaining notoriety. He led a rebellion against the shogunate and defeated one Magu Kenki puppet and then stole the other one. Asase Hibiki, who had returned to the Asase Shrine after the cataclysm and the death of her lover, worried for Akodomeki, and in an attempt to assist him, she unsealed the resentful remains of the Thunderbird, Kapatsir, also known as the Thundering Manifestation. She hoped it would destroy the shogunate's ships. And, well, it did, but the Thundering Manifestation also whipped up an incredibly powerful storm, which again did destroy the ships, but also cast Akodomeki and his crew out to sea, where they became lost. Eventually, they were shipwrecked on the Golden Apple Archipelago with one of the Magu Kenki puppets still on board. The unsealed Thundering Manifestation made Seirai uninhabitable, and those who lived there were forced to evacuate. Now, roughly around this same time, Scaramouche woke inexplicably and began to wander around Inazuma. He was eventually discovered at Nazuchi Beach by Niwa Katsuragi, the apprentice to Inspector Mikoshi Nagamasa of the Tatarasuna Forge. As you may recall, Mikoshi Nagamasa was Iwakura Doki's brother. Katsuragi became Scaramouche's first taste of family, but a combination of revelations about his origins and the influence of the Tatarigami led to tragedy, resulting in the deaths of all present at the Tatarasuna Forge, except Scaramouche. So he continued to wander for a time, eventually meeting a young child likely still on Yashiori Island. The child was alone and dying of disease, potentially the same disease caused by the Tatarigami. Now, presumably, Scaramouche made the journey to Narukami Shrine to seek help from Yaemiko, but help either never arrived or arrived too late to save the child. Scaramouche never recovered emotionally and eventually left Inazuma aboard a Fatui ship. He later became a harbinger. He would return to Inazuma some 300 years later to wreak havoc on the Raiden Gokuden, the swordsmithing school. He sabotaged 3 of the 5 branches from the shadows, but when he tried to destroy the Ishin school, he met Kaedehara Kazuha's great-grandfather and recognized him as the descendant of Niwa Katsuragi, one of the few people Scaramouche considered to be his family and, well, maybe found family is a better term. He let Kazuha's great-grandfather, Kaedehara Yoshinori, live, but the man was so terrified that Scaramouche would come back that he disbanded the Ishin school of forging on his own. Only the Amenoma school of forging was left. Another 100 or so years later, the Fatui would return once again to Inazuma to set up a delusion factory on Yashiori Island. This was to take advantage of the Tatarigami and the available crystal marrow. They also convinced Ei's puppet body, also known as the Shogun, to close off the entire country and seize every vision within it. This prompted a civil war. At this point, Kazuha's unnamed friend decided to challenge the Shogun to a duel, and he lost. Kazuha took his friend's vision and fled Inazuma. He was eventually picked up by Beidou and joined her pirate crew, only returning to Inazuma at the traveler's request. That is the point at which history ends and the Inazuma Archon quest begins, so I'll stop here. This marks the end of the beginner's guide to Inazuma, but since we're always getting new information, please make sure to check the pinned comment for updates and corrections. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Beginner's Guide to Genshin Lore.